I'm gonna chime right in and pick up this thread of the scene, and I'm gonna dive a little more into the theory, Lorenzer's theory, and the challenges of translation. And so the scene is the primary experiential unit for Lorenzer. And I think there's a great link to the SQUID tradition and the methods that we use, both clinically and in psychosocial research, because the scene, as Dan pointed out, also connects us as a subject, as the investigator of the researcher, to whatever we study that we try to understand. And there's also a link back to the Aristotle quote. We are part of the scene. In clinical analysis with the patient, we become part of the scene. We're in the transference, countertransference relationship. That's a scene that is playing out between us. And if we study anything out there, we also are implied in the scene if we want to understand whatever social field we're studying. And so we sent around these excerpts of our translation, and I chose for us to talk about a little more the worst theoretical bit, which I really love, which is chapter 4 of the tiefen hermeneutische Kulturanalyse. And in this chapter, there's a few of these translation delights, because Lorenzer is so impossible to translate. It's so bulky, it's so idiosyncratic, it's so German. So yeah, it's fun. And so Lorenzer, if you read the excerpts in this chapter 4, he really reformulates Freud's Triebtheorie, drive theory, in order to show how the notion of the drive, already the drive, implies the dialectics of nature and society from the get-go. So, and he also spells out a theory of symbolization implied in Freud's conception of the system's preconscious and unconscious. And so I'm going to briefly summarize this very dense chapter. Lorenzer revisits Freud's The Unconscious of 1915 and compares this metapsychology to the neurophysiological work on aphasia of 1891. And in The Unconscious, Freud distinguishes the unconscious as opposed to the preconscious, or to be precise, the unconscious versus the conscious presentation. And that's Vorstellung in German. And here we encounter a first translation issue, as the German Vorstellung was translated as presentation by Sveitschi, and it's a good translation, right? Vorstellung, presentation. But it also misses something, which is the double meaning of Vorstellung in German, which also implies that it's a simple idea. I have a Vorstellung, I have an idea. It's not just a presentation. Presentation makes it a little more complicated already. It's also just a simple idea that I have. It's a cognition. So already an interesting translation issue. And I quote Freud in English: "The conscious presentation comprises the presentation of the thing, plus the presentation of the word belonging to it, while the unconscious presentation is the presentation of the thing alone." End quote. Now, Lorenzer argues that the Freudian epistemological subject is both psychosocial and biological. How so? Firstly, I quote, the epistemological subject and the experiential object are neither opposed to nor contrasted with each other, end quote. So what's at stake here is the human subject of psychoanalysis and how this subject, das Erkenntnissubjekt in German, experiences and makes meaning of their Lebenswelt, Husserl's Lebenswelt, the life world. And that includes the dimension of the dynamic unconscious. And this is what we explore both in clinical psychoanalysis and in psychoanalytic social research when we're trying to understand social fields, practices, institutions, and so on. And so let's take a look at this diagram that Lorenzer takes from Freud. You have it all in front of you, maybe. I can also show you or do a screen share. This is the thing I'm talking about. Can you see it?
Yes.
Do you have it?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we see here is a Freudian diagram about Sachvorstellung and Wortvorstellung, thing presentation and word presentation, and how they're related. And Freud says a word acquires its meaning by being linked to an object presentation. The object presentation itself is a complex of associations made up of the greatest variety of visual, acoustic, tactile, kinesthetic, and other presentations. The object presentation is thus seen to be one which is not closed and almost one which cannot be closed, while the word presentation is seen to be something closed, even though capable of extension. So we have the open sensory perception, object associations, versus a word presentation that is already closed. Okay, and Lorenzer now highlights this highlights the associative process.
Katharina, may I ask you something?
Yeah.
Could you please elaborate a little bit on the openness and the closeness? I mean, it's hard for me to grasp.
Okay, so we're perceiving through senses the world, yes? And in this, we are open to the world. We experience the life world, we experience life, and that is through the senses, and the scenes are multi-sensual, sensory, and the associations are open. There is always more.
Yeah.
And the associations that we have through these scenes are open in that it's not just a word that is a word and there's an object connected to the word, but it's a whole scene where we're open to the world through the senses. Yeah. And it's not just one meaning. We cannot just break it down to one meaning. It's open through the senses. We are open, permeable through the senses, and then also through associations. And so now Lorenzer highlights this associative process and says that the associations belong neither to the object nor to the subject. So das Erkenntnissubjekt, the epistemological subject, das Erkenntnissubjekt, and the experiential object, der Erfahrungsgegenstand, are not opposed to each other. So, experiential complexes together form a system of memory traces. And this is going back to the very early Freud of the 1800s, where Freud uses the term of engram and memory trace as the neurophysiological embodiment of experience. And so das Erkenntnissubjekt, and now we're coming back to a translation issue, das Erkenntnissubjekt is literally the subject who gains knowledge using their senses. And then there is the Erfahrungsgegenstand. It's the object of experience. It's the experiential object. And that's the translation we used. We translated this a little scientifically, which is a problem. But by doing that, we wanted to highlight that in German, they are fixed terms, like it's one word, Erkenntnissubjekt, Erfahrungsgegenstand. They're both each one word. But what we lose in this translation is the comprehensibility of Erkenntnis, gaining knowledge. So the point I'm making is that we always lose something in translation. And it's always a transference, if you will. We create a new scene by translating, which is also something we might want to discuss. I'm trying to be short now. So Lorenzer's big work now lies in capturing this dialectic of neurophysiology and society, even in his conception of the drive. And Lorenzer does that by using the terms of memory traces and what is a memory trace? It comes about through, quote, precipitations, Niederschläge, of the experiential contents of memory traces. So what Lorenzer finally says is, we do not perceive objects at first. We are immersed in scenes. So the scene is an experiential unit. It is psychosocial. It comes first. And the scenes become embodied through memory traces, engrams in our neurophysiology. And to round it off, so the scene is the primary experiential unit. We participate in a scene when we try to understand something with a patient or with an object of study. So in employing scenic understanding, we become part of the scene. And finally, and I'm not going to go into detail, I think, but I'm open to questions about the conception of the drive that Lorenzer does. In this conception of the drive emerges through the Freud's, through Lebensnot. We translated this as life emergencies. So there are emergencies, there's Lebensnot at the source of the drive. The baby needs something. It gets something through another, the mother. So this something is already specific. It's social already. And so the drive comes about because the baby is born in utter dependency on another. And the way in which the needs are being met is both deeply social and biological. And so Lorenzer translates the drive as forms of interaction to make clear that it's already something psychosocial. So if you will, forms of interaction is now a new word for the drive, what makes the drive. It's forms of interaction. And so now I'm going to stop here because there's already plenty to discuss, I think. And it's quite dense.